Welcome from the Royal Society of Canada. Canada's National Academy, the Royal Society of Canada, recognizes Canada's leading intellectuals, scholars, researchers, and artists, and mobilizes them in open discussion and debate to advance knowledge, encourage integrated interdisciplinary understandings, and address issues that are critical to Canada and Canadians. To begin, I acknowledge that the Royal Society of Canada is hosting this event, and their offices are located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. From coast to coast, we're grateful to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples, and recognize the many languages and cultures Indigenous people have brought and that enrich what many call Turtle Island. Today's event explores themes of the Royal Society of Canada policy briefing on protecting expert advice for the public, promoting safety and improved communications. This briefing analyzes the extent to which researchers who publicly share their expertise and the results of their research face harassment and personal threats. The intimidation of experts has recently garnered significant media attention, but it's a problem that has affected the safety, well-being, and work of those who produce knowledge for some time. There's significant risk not only to researchers, but also to the public if the threat of intimidation prevents researchers from sharing knowledge and expertise. I'm Wendy Hee-Gyung Chun, Simon Fraser University's Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media, Director of the Digital Democracies Institute, and Professor in the School of Communication, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'm delighted to briefly introduce the panelists: Julia M. Wright, Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, George Monro Chair in Literature and Rhetoric in the Department of English at Dalhousie University and lead author of the briefing. Howard Ramos, Professor in the Department of Sociology at Western University, and Amanda Clark, Associate Professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University. And unfortunately, our co-author, Dr. Matthew Herder, has been forced to withdraw due to personal reasons. So first, we'll hear from Dr. Wright as lead author of the report, followed by Drs. Ramos and Clark. And following this, we'll open the conversation to questions from the audience. And to participate in the Q&A, please submit your question via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Should you wish to join the conversation online or learn more about RSC events, policy briefings, and so on, please follow RSC on Twitter at @RSC, capital T, the capital A Academies. The handle has also been included on the PowerPoint slides. So let's turn to Dr. Wright, lead author of the briefing.
Thank you, Wendy, and thanks to the Royal Society of Canada for hosting this discussion and supporting this kind of work for the benefit of Canadians. Our policy briefing responds to growing concerns about the intimidation of researchers who speak about their expertise in public. Our 7 recommendations basically balance 3 goals: researcher safety, stronger research communications, and gathering further information to advance the first 2 goals. As a literature scholar who also works in cultural studies, I'd like to take a few minutes today to think about research communications in terms of the principles on which we communicate in recognizable and effective ways. Of particular concern in our briefing is what's called knowledge mobilization, that is, pushing scholarship out to non-academic audiences. Research agencies might ask us to assess non-academic audience in terms of numbers. How many people come to a talk? how many downloads, how many retweets, how many website visitors. There are conventional strategies for boosting those numbers, and two common pathways are getting attention and having a story. Having a story, as in short storytellers, for instance, grows out of business advice to tell a story, as here in the Harvard Business Review, where it is explicitly distinguished from the stuff of research, what they call all the rational things. Literature scholars, of course, work on stories. And for us, this idea of a story is much more fraught and complex. We also work on ideas of attention. John Guillory has talked about the difference between reading as play and reading as work, for instance, different kinds and intensities of attention. But a lot of attention isn't about focus, but distraction. Shock jock radio in the 1980s, literature about violent anti-heroes like American Psycho and celebrity gossip. They're all about grabbing attention by being surprising, with bonus points for being controversial enough to get more attention through boycotts and news articles. Go back to shock jock radio and comedians in the 1980s. Misogyny, racism, political polarization, they were all there. It wasn't Lenny Bruce or George Carlin challenging censorship and the political establishment in earlier decades, though they were outrageous too. Sam Kinison more or less just screamed, and I don't think anyone's quite clear on whether he was expressing impotent white male rage or satirizing it. The shock jocks modeled a form of discourse that has transitioned smoothly to social media, where these kinds of violent attacks are all too common. These celebrities were aligned with the political right in the United States when Reagan was president, and conservatism was becoming less fiscal and much more intolerant. And they were high profile just as the internet began to take off as a social platform. Now we live in an age of web design that is centered on getting us to a site and keeping us there as long as possible. There are design features that require us to wait and to respond, like stretching a list with 20 best foods for whatever ails you out to 20 slow to download pages full of ads, so that we have to scroll through and click next, wait for it to load, scroll through, click next. It's like listening to Sam Kinison scream. There's almost no informational content, just a strategy for holding our attention. So when we talk about getting more attention for research, what exactly do we mean? Because when we ask the public to pay attention to our work, we are asking for their time. And there are few things we have that are more precious than our time. When we demand that researchers get attention in order to achieve the requirements of research funding, are we like those clickbait websites, drawing on people's time in order to get money into our universities? That we're doing it in the pursuit of knowledge, does that erase the problems with it? In other words, are we reinforcing marketing strategies designed to capture people's attention and sell it when we engage in similar behaviors? And if so, do we risk the same negative outcomes? These are questions that we need to explore more fully with communication scholars and scholars of culture in the room, as we recommend in our policy briefing. The other strategy I hear a lot is tell a story. I've been told to tell a story to increase support from my faculty, to find donors for graduate programs, and to write someone's application for a prize. But that phrase is deceptively simple. They don't want a tragic story. They don't want an absurd story. They don't want slapstick, satire, science fiction, or an apocalypse. They want a very specific kind of story. A story of a hero who sees a problem in the world, fights against adversity, and succeeds. This is Joseph Campbell's monomyth in broad outlines, and it's used in Hollywood script writing. George Lucas used it for Star Wars. It is everywhere. Does it belong in accounts of research, though? It reinforces the myth of the scientist hero, the solitary genius who sees further and knows better. But that isn't how research works. It is intensely collaborative at every step, including peer review. Our policy briefing, for instance, had 5 co-authors, the 4 of us plus Matthew Herder, who couldn't be here today, unfortunately. We cited the work of about 100 authors and a dozen institutional or agency documents. The briefing had 3 peer reviewers and a peer review monitor. It was also reviewed by a number of others before it was released, including the president of the Royal Society of Canada. These are the real metrics of scholarship. A peer-reviewed piece of scholarship is built out of the work of dozens, hundreds, even thousands of researchers. As I've argued elsewhere, misinformation often relies on Campbell's monomyth too. The hero who sees a problem in the world fights against powerful forces that want to maintain the problem, but has the solution that will save us. That's Trump's election platform in a nutshell. It is only one kind of story, though. Instead of the legend of Galileo defying the Inquisition because he was right and they were wrong, a common story we hear, we need to remember Newton, who wrote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." When I've seen this cited, it's usually to stress the standing on the shoulders of giants part, that he built on the work of others. But let's pause and appreciate the importance of that if. We don't know if we have seen further until our work is tested, discussed, reviewed. Researchers are not heroes, and we don't change everything just by doing our jobs. We work and live in the space of that if. My larger point here is that the kinds of stories we tell, the plot, the goal, the obstacles, carry information beyond the content. The kinds of stories that work well in marketing to sell something may not be in the public interest or, as that Harvard Business Review article put it, rational. Framing research to get more clicks rather than explaining it can backfire and support misinformation. As we suggest in our policy briefing, we must think more deeply about how we do the important work of sharing research with the public. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wright, for your thoughtful comments. It's now my pleasure to turn to Dr. Ramos.
Thank you. In the past couple of decades, universities and those who fund them have increasingly encouraged academics to engage in knowledge mobilization and knowledge translation. This in itself is arguably a good thing, as academics are impartial and independent experts who offer insights that are missed by other sectors. The private sector, for example, often engages in issues with a degree of self-interest and a profit motivation. The government sector will do the same with the interest of protecting the state. The NGO sector may engage with issues in a value-laden or an activist agenda. Academics work with folks from each of these sectors, and the strength of their insights are to balance across them and to offer advice based on deep expertise and evidence. A vibrant academic sector that engages the public is a key component to a healthy society and is essential for protecting democracy. At the same time, that academics have been increasingly encouraged to engage broader public audiences and work outside of the so-called ivory tower, the social and public context has also radically changed. In many regards, this has been linked to rapid and profound technological change that has come with social media, the internet, and other online technology. That is, the tools and forums for engaging the public and accessing research has shifted. So too has the attention cycle, which is increasingly insatiable in its appetite for information, which now has a broad reach and a 24-hour information cycle. With the internet and social media, we no longer simply engage our local community, but rather anyone who speaks the same language as we do and uses the same apps or the same platforms and across any time zone in the world. Academics have also seen the academic cycle change with an emphasis on open data, open science, and preprint publications, and have felt the need to use social media to brand themselves and their research in pursuit of knowledge mobilization, and increasingly perceive that they must do so rather than seeing it as value-added work that is voluntary. Together, technological change, shifting news cycles, shifting academic cycles, and social change has meant that the world is increasingly seeing contested information. We hear of fake news, fake facts, fake research, and academics compete with bots. They compete with the average Jane or Joe and other researchers to get their information out. They are also increasingly asked by journalists and media to comment on pressing stories and pressing issues before peer-reviewed work comes out, and they are often asked to comment in real time with science that is often in its infancy and still contested. Also, although the perceived expectation is for experts to be there, at the same time, experts may say things that people may not want to hear. We can see this, for example, during the pandemic, where researchers quickly pivoted their work to address issues around COVID-19. And we saw the process of scientific debate unfolding in the public eye in ways that are, dare I say, the cliche of the last 2 years, unprecedented. This has meant that the public has seen facts change, disputed across a number of sources, and few spaces of information to be curated or sifted through so that we have a steward of our information. The result has been a distrust in science, researchers, institutions as a whole, and a challenge to open science and democracy. It can be seen, for example, in the 2021 Canadian Edelman Trust Barometer, which shows that academic experts had a 16 percentage point decrease in the level of trust that people have towards them. We can also see this across other sectors with technical experts, NGO representatives, and journalists as well, albeit with lower levels of decline. In part, this is because trust has already been decreasing in some of those other sectors. Unfortunately, the very technology that has made it easier to access a wider audience and to do so in real time has also changed how easy it is to harass, intimidate, and threaten experts. Those who speak publicly have faced backlash, and that is not new. What is new is the scale at which it happens and how easy it is to harass people on so many different platforms. It has become institutionalized, and harassers could be a bot or a person from literally anywhere in the world. Even more unfortunate is the reality that researchers who are women, along with those who are Indigenous peoples or people of color, are often most likely to face the harshest harassment, which is often misogynistic and racist in nature. It has become much easier for people to complain or harass in ways that are far more personal than it would have been a decade or two ago. Academics and researchers have their web profiles, pictures, and all sorts of information publicly available. Things have gotten so bad that we've seen associations for medical doctors or journalists issuing statements in their defense. It's now, sadly, time that we do the same in defense of academic researchers and experts too. This is why we've worked on this report. In many ways, we document the problems that people have known for some time, but haven't named publicly or at a national scale. Our report shows that it's time to act and time to take countermeasures to assure that researchers are supported in their public engagement. If we don't guarantee that there is an ability to engage public safely, we face a slippery slope and a fog of information. As we act, there's a role to play for federal and provincial governments, universities, the media sector, academics and researchers, as well as the general public. We believe that experts play a vital role in our society, and we need to ensure that they can do so safely. Only then can we have a truly vibrant and open society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramos. It's now my pleasure to turn to Dr. Clark. I'll remind everybody in the audience that we'll be going to Q&A afterwards. So if you'd like to participate, please remember to submit your question via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen.
Thank you very much. So we've laid out the problem. I'm going to use my time today to lay out our proposed solutions as detailed in the report. Before jumping into these recommendations, a note on their scope. So we don't presume in the report to offer solutions to the larger chronic challenges within which attacks on scholarly researchers are situated. Like, for instance, the distorting influence and largely unaccountable role of private digital platforms in social and political life, systemic racism and misogyny, the discontents of late-stage capitalism, or dwindling societal trust in the state and collective institutions. Evidently, if we tackled those things, this would have been a very meaty report and probably something that we'd all want to spend some time with. Instead, what we did do was focus really on the acute issue and what we see as challenges that could be resolved in the near term with levers that we have at our disposal within a couple of key institutions. So we acknowledge again that there's this pressing need to take immediate action to manage these threats and create the conditions in which publicly engaged scholarship can flourish without individual researchers being attacked or made to feel insecure. So our recommendations target three key actors. First, we focus on research funding agencies, in particular the Tri-Council. We focus on the federal government as our second main target because it's the level of government that has Canada-wide responsibility for research and innovation. And we also note that some of our recommendations that are targeted to the federal government could still apply to provinces as well. And our third main target is the post-secondary sector. So focusing on the levers and powers of these actors, we present 7 recommendations, which are grouped into 3 categories. In the interest of time, I'm going to highlight a few of our specific recommendations within each of the 3 themes that we highlight in the report. So the first set of recommendations really focuses on information gathering and measurement in order that we can generate a richer picture of this problem. As Howard noted, we've all known that this issue exists. We see examples of it from time to time in the media. We might have a colleague who's experienced this, but that's not sufficient to really understand the scope, scale, and particular dynamics of this problem. And that's where measurement becomes helpful. So there's really no systematic way right now to identify and monitor threats that are posed to researchers. And we also acknowledge that reality that in many instances, these threats are experienced at a very private level, in an email, in a private message on Twitter, for example, and also by researchers who may lack the resources, knowledge, or frankly, the emotional bandwidth if they're being harassed or threatened to call out this activity and sort of publicize it. So with this in mind, we call on Statistics Canada to implement follow-up waves and expand the survey of post-secondary faculty and researchers so that we can collect data on harassment, intimidation, and other threats from outside of scholars' institutions. And we also call on the federal government to initiate, sort of in collaboration with the Canada Research Coordinating Committee and other relevant agencies, a nationwide coordinated approach to gathering information about online threats and harassment across sectors. So moving to the second set of recommendations, we shift from measurement to, I think, a deeper question, a more existential question about how we frame public research communications. And this picks up on a lot of the points that Julia so helpfully led us off with. So under this recommendation, set of recommendations, first we suggest that the tri-agency strike a multidisciplinary task force to develop a more robust, concrete, and nuanced framework for knowledge mobilization. In the course of preparing this report, it was remarkable that such a framework does not really exist in Canada, nor have we seen thoughtful, open, critical conversations about the objectives and intended outcomes of scholarly knowledge mobilization. And this is despite this being a prioritized facet of grant application assessments and other professional evaluations in academia today. So this recommendation would really help us instigate that important work. Getting into some of the points that Julia discussed, this could force us to really examine how we may have, with sort of unconsciously, incrementally, and certainly without open discussion, been led into certain ideas about what good public engagement and good knowledge mobilization would look like. And if we really scrutinize that, in a lot of cases, we're drawing ideas about sort of valuable knowledge mobilization from the worlds of marketing and communications, which are arguably not the most robust venues to turn to when thinking about how to encourage collaborative, respectful listening, learning, and productive disagreement across different perspectives. Instead, the world of marketing and communication tends to focus on sort of sensational, simplistic narratives, as Julia noted. There are other traditions in academia that we could turn to think about what good knowledge mobilization looks like. One example would be the open science movement or community engaged research. And typically those traditions are rooted much more in the values of humility, collaboration, and certainly really dwell on that sort of if statement that Julia led with, the idea that we don't presume to have all the knowledge, and that we know knowledge is inherently co-produced and eternally open for contestation. And that could be a very rich space to begin thinking about knowledge mobilization as opposed to Twitter flame wars. Our third set of recommendations shifts to focusing on what is arguably the most immediate need and potentially the most low-hanging fruit, which is just providing very direct and clear mechanisms of support for researchers who are threatened. So when we look across post-secondary institutions, we don't see sort of readily accessible policies or action plans to support scholars who are harassed, threatened, or intimidated. And that seems like a very glaring and problematic gap that can be resolved with fairly little effort. So we suggest that post-secondary institutions, perhaps in collaboration to share this work, could produce clear, accessible action plans to which scholars could turn to know who they need to call if they're threatened, to equip campus police, local police forces if they need to be implicated, IT services, so that there's an awareness of what can be done to protect scholars when these kinds of threats and harassment are posed at them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section. To give you some time and to start the conversation, I have many questions. And as you can see, you'll see why it was such a joy to collaborate with everyone on this panel about this briefing. So my question has to do with the pandemic. As Julia, you pointed out, there's a larger historical context for this. And Amanda, you also pointed to the recommendations speaking to this history. But Howard, you also pointed out that there was something about the pandemic which seemed to change the view of experts. So do you all think that something's happened because of the pandemic or in response to the pandemic? And should we be concerned about the changes that have happened?
Shall I go first?
Yes.
I think that's a really fascinating question. And I think we're still in that space of that new Tonic if. We're still waiting to see how this is all going to shake out. In a time of pandemic, you see a lot of uncertainty and people want information. And because they have wanted information, they have turned to various sources. And those various sources have included academic scholars, as well as less carefully put together kinds of expertise. So I think there's been this general hunger for information, and which is kind of interesting because you might expect that people would just want distraction. And certainly there's been a lot of consumption of streamed media and so on, but there's also been this hunger for information. And as much as we've been talking a lot in the news media about misinformation and people who are getting the wrong idea from the wrong sources, I think that's nevertheless a really interesting moment for us to think about education as something which is not finite, as something that ends when you get a piece of paper, a degree or a high school diploma, but something that is ongoing, that people continue to be curious. They continue to want to learn and find out about the world. So I think this is potentially a really positive move, but at the moment, of course, we're seeing mostly the damaging effects of that uncertainty leading people down the wrong paths.
I would agree with what Julia said, and I think that there are a few things that are kind of unique to the last couple of years. Some of the things that are unique, I mean, we've all become armchair epidemiologists and tried to learn about information. But in doing so, we've also learned that science is messy and that science has debate. And I think that when things are messy and have debate, it's very easy for people to begin to lose confidence in, well, what is the actual answer with a capital A? And the reality is science comes through consensus and peer review and is this longer process. And so we've been in a really acute window where people are looking for information really quickly, dealing with a messy process at a time where we still haven't come to some solid norms. I think that now 2 years into it, we do have some norms. We know masks make a difference. We know airflow is important, but we certainly didn't know that in March 2020. And I think that that's part of what is linked to some of these changes. And I think that the other part of it is we see algorithmic influence in terms of 2 years of being stuck in front of our computers and maybe having some echo chambers.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that, as with so many things during the pandemic, issues that were already bubbling away or that were sort of thriving, but maybe not in the spotlight, were kind of exposed and amplified. And so it was the lack of, the dwindling trust in expertise and in sort of traditional institutions, in government, in expertise as a kind of concept, is a really dangerous beginning place for a pandemic that rests on sort of the collective accepting a whole bunch of limitations to their personal freedoms in support of broader societal good, right? And that's why high trust societies fared much better in a lot of cases during the pandemic, because they were willing to agree to things like vaccine mandates, and they were willing to accept dictates from government about restricting movement and not seeing family members. And so I hope that one of the things we could take from this is an acknowledgement that we need to do the hard work of civic literacy, building trust and confidence in collective institutions so that we're better equipped to handle the next existential crisis that we face, or that we're all facing. Hello, climate change. So obviously the pandemic represents a critical juncture. I think the early signs are suggesting that the camp that is focused on learning from this and building a more robust, democratic, pluralistic society needs to do a bit more work, because the other side, which is capitalizing on this to drive divisive fear and suggest that our governments have failed us, is pretty loud right now. So yeah, I think hopefully our report can be part of helping that former voice shape the directions going forward.
Thank you all. And those resonate so nicely with the beginnings call for thinking through collaboration. What does that mean? So we have a question from Maria Ahmed, and she asks, how can young researchers counter this narrative of telling a compelling story for the sake of getting published? What are some alternatives for emerging scholars?
My gut reaction is emerging scholars shouldn't have to do this work. That it is up to the senior scholars who sit on adjudication committees at the Tri-Council, who sit on tenure and promotion committees, who contribute to peer review. It is up to us to think about the protocols we bring to bear when we think about what counts as important work and valid work. And that it should not be up to the early career scholars to do the heavy lifting of working towards cultural change. If there's anything on which they should have to just sort of coast on coattails, it should be the hard work of changing academic culture, which is not an easy thing. So that's my gut reaction to that. The other thing I think we can do in some disciplines is call attention to the rhetorics that we're being asked to participate in, to actually fold into how we tell the story of our work. You might expect me to say something like this because that's the norm, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to cast a spotlight on those kinds of assumptions to encourage you to rethink those assumptions. So I think that's another strategy in some disciplines we can use. For instance, I am very fond of pointing out that innovation means newfangling. It's an empty, hollow word. It just means new. And I think we need to call BS on that kind of jargon, because that's part of this corporatization of academic culture as well. And it steers us away from precision and productivity and really meaningful engagement.
I completely echo what Julia has said, which is the weight of the burden shouldn't be on early career researchers. And it should be on the shoulders of those who are doing the peer review, the evaluation. And it's about the people who have achieved promotion and tenure to really begin to change the culture that has increasingly become untenable. We can't be our own publicist, we can't be our own researchers, and be our own everything else all at the same time. There's only, as I would say, 24 hours in a 28-hour day of tasks, and that's something that we really need to work on as academics, as well as universities. But I also think that for early career researchers, there's a lot of different ways of being an academic, and to recognize that you don't have to do all of them, and that although there's a perception that you need to do all of them, there is no need to do them all, and really just do the things that you care about, have a passion for, and that you have deep expertise, and that's the best way forward.
Amanda, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I'm just thinking back. I'm not that far out from when I was beginning my academic career, and I think that at that time I was fortunate enough to be researching in an area where there was a lot of interest in government and talking to people who were doing the kind of research I was doing. And from that, I realized that there are actually a lot of really under the radar ways that you can still be very publicly engaged. And I think we have to start thinking, so totally what Julie and Howard said, it's up to those who are higher up to, when you're looking at applications for jobs, for tenure track positions, or you're evaluating grants, like don't just pay attention to whether or not they had a blog or started a podcast or, write op-eds. Those can be really valuable. There's also tons of other activities, giving community talks, meeting with policymakers. And that kind of activity doesn't necessarily throw you into the spotlight in the same way that some of these online platforms do. And we really need to start privileging those other ways of engaging. It doesn't have to be that you started a mini series on Netflix or whatever.
Thank you. So we also have a question from Debbie Martin, and she writes, I appreciate the discussion about the growing need to make research clickbait worthy, but with that need to make research timely and immediate, we lose the ability to think deeply and critically. What I'm worried about is that we are growing and encouraging academics to become social media influencers than actually contributing to scholarship in a meaningful way, and then using their cadre of followers to dismiss any critique of their work. Just a comment that I'd love to hear the panelists weigh in on. And I know that many of you addressed this in your comments, but perhaps we can.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in on that. I think part of it is we don't want to overstate the problem. I think there are many academics who would completely agree with Debbie's assessment of what social media can offer research, and as a result they step back. And are you being punished in your career for not engaging at that? I mean, not necessarily. At the end of the day, probably what your department is spending the most time on is how many, or in your review boards, etc., is like citations on your articles. So it's easy to sort of step away from it. And maybe that's just what we need to do more of, is have the confidence. It's always I'm always sort of impressed when I meet an academic who just says, yeah, I'm not going to do the Twitter thing. Like, I'm not interested in that. And having that, we just do that more. And then on the other hand, also maybe acknowledge that there are spaces for some of these tools to be quite useful. And again, to reference my own work, I mean, I find being involved in, because the community of people that I'm engaging with on social media are largely public servants who are interested in fairly niche topics like data governance and how the Westminster system can be updated. It's quite collaborative, and I learn a lot through these networks as well. So there's a rosier side of this. You just have to sort of find your community and then maybe avoid the trolls as much as possible, and you can do it. But I also think just withdrawing is like more of that. That is probably totally fine.
And I think that, there's the part of it too is to add to what Amanda was saying, is for us to also recognize that there's a space for different paces of research and different paces of engagement, and that we can value community engaged work, which takes years to develop relationships and partnerships, and that we shouldn't expect those to have the same pace as a quick reaction. And I think it's important for us also to be able to better articulate the different audiences that we engage, and at the different parts of our career and research cycle that we might engage them. So, very much to kind of the points that Amanda was raising, and it is that, talking at your kid's PTA is public engagement that's very meaningful. And very different than a quick response to a war over social media and these kind of things. I think the other thing that's really important is also for people to be public and share their experience. And this is something I really think is really important with our report, is it's really hard to find, and it can feel very isolating if you don't realize how widespread the problem is. And I could be wrong in saying this, but you know, when I felt that I was the only person getting hate mail, I felt very targeted and alone. But when I found out and talked to other folks that know this has existed, I was like, okay, well, I'm glad it's not just me. But then I got really kind of concerned because, well, hang on a second, if it's going on this much, why don't we have better systems to try and engage it? And so I think that, you know, there's lots of different points around it of the audience, recognizing a slower pace is acceptable, and also recognizing a more open and transparent kind of recognition that we don't just magically pop out beautiful social media engagements or create the Netflix series and at the same time having a high impact research article. We don't need to do it all at the same time.
I would like to push at this idea of audience a little bit, because the question reminds me of an experience I had when I was a graduate student. If I can get anecdotal for a moment, I was at a very large conference and there was a keynote, and the organizers of a literature conference had decided to open up our discussion in more interdisciplinary ways by inviting an historian to speak to us. And the historian had tried to meet us halfway by talking about novels, but was talking about novels as an historian rather than as a literature scholar. And so it was really very interesting. And it really highlighted some interesting disciplinary differences. But one of the senior scholars in the room stood up and said, in literary study, we don't do that. In literary study, we don't say things like this. In literary study, we bring this kind of evidence, and basically spent 10 minutes saying to this very generous historian how everything he had done was wrong in the scholar's eyes. And because we were in person, we could all be collectively horrified. And we spent the next 3 days talking about what bad behavior that was. And how when somebody is trying to be generous, you respond, especially when someone's trying to be generous, but always be generous with other scholars. That kind of dressing down, it was somebody trying to gain position by tearing someone else down. And we all saw it for what it was, but we could talk to each other about it. One of the things that happens with a Twitter pile-on is that you don't necessarily see the shocked responses of the thousands of people looking at it. The most you can do on Twitter, if it's an area of your expertise, you might intervene and say, hold on a minute, this isn't fair. But if you're not an expert, you see the pile-on, and maybe the best thing you can do is simply not amplify any of it, which isn't really this kind of collective horror that was a way of learning how to behave and not to behave when we all got to meet in person. And I think it's one of the real losses of the pandemic, that we've lost those kinds of peer support networks and that sense of civil behavior. We've been talking for decades now about the digital bubble and how people are isolated from each other by interacting through technology. And we've got a running gag in academic circles about reviewer two, who is so rude that you can't stand it because they're anonymous. And that's being amplified through the shift to social media and made worse by the fact that we are all interacting in technological ways now. So I think there's something to be said for talking about this, but talking about that kind of rudeness, talking about being generous readers, and that maybe what you want to be known for in social media is being supportive rather than being the jerk who comes in and says, everyone listen to me, nobody else matters. And I think those conversations are really important. I think one of the sort of threads of our policy briefing is an invitation to academics to be more self-aware of what they are doing when they engage with the public and with each other in public. And I think that's something we could all use more of.
Thank you. So I want to shift things slightly and maybe bring the two questions together, because I know while we were writing the report, we were very concerned about the different types of experts and how certain types of experts face more harassment than others. And this also goes to the question of emerging scholars and how we can protect them and also think through things. So did you all, and I know Carolyn Radz has done some fantastic work around the kinds of harassment that journalists face. And she insists that we need to think through it differently. There's sort of gendered endemic harassment that happens no matter what you're talking about. And then there's response-specific harassment. So did you all want to talk a bit more about the specific groups of experts that face more harassment than others and how we need to think through the framing and responses?
I'll dive in. That's absolutely correct. I think we see it a lot with academic forms of harassment, that somebody who explicitly speaks on feminist issues is very likely to get very specific kinds of threats, that the threats are tied to the topic in really concerning ways. And this is something we deal with a bit in the policy briefing, is that there's this sort of general view that when we speak as experts, we are giving our personal opinion, and therefore it is rooted in our personal experience in some way. And that is used to discredit expertise on issues that are tied to particular identities, say women, for instance. And I think that's the fundamental confusion we need to deal with, but it's also a kind of cheap shot. We have a logical fallacy called ad hominem, that you attack the person and not the statements. And pretty much the research, attacks on researchers falls into that category by turning on the person and trying to discredit the person rather than actually countering the argument. You completely move away from any kind of rational, reasoned, evidence-based discussion. Because you might change your mind. You're not going to change who you are necessarily in quite the same way. So I think that's where those kinds of problems come in, that there's this very quick way of saying, you're not saying this because you have 3 degrees and you've been studying this as a scholar for 10 years and you've written 5 books on the subject that have met peer review. You're saying this because you are X. And journalists face the same problem. Of course, they have their own areas of expertise as well, and the topics that they are responsible for. And it's an echo of what we see in academic circles. But it is absolutely a significant problem.
And of course, it intersects with, or is driven by, the problem that you began with, Julia, which is that we're increasingly told to personalize our research and insert our own narrative. You know, my parents were immigrants and we moved here when I was 5, and that's why I study small businesses in Chinatown. You know, like, this is a very typical, and that would work, that would sell. Like, you would get big, you know, some grants specifically want you to make this about you. And I mean, there's some truth to it, and there's some honesty, and I think acknowledging our subjectivity that we bring to our work, of course. But the more we try to drive these individualistic sort of hero narratives of research that is rooted in some personal struggle, the more you've kind of lend credibility to those critiques, which would say, well, you only believe that because of your identity. You can't operate in an objective way separate from that, or that you represent an entire group. So and I think this is why I really like that the report talks about this need to have a frank conversation, you know, across disciplines and across institutions about, like, what exactly we're looking for from this sort of engagement. Because if you want sort of very personalized storytelling, that's not what academic research is supposed to be about, and it creates a lot of problems.
And you know, I might add, you know, that it's also important for universities and academics to recognize that we live in a misogynistic and racist society, and it's systemic. So we can't expect that in our engagement we won't face this. And so part of the solution is to recognize the issues that come in terms of personal narrative and personal attributes, but also recognize the broader systemic issues. And as universities claim to be pursuing inclusive excellence and equity, diversity, and inclusion, it means also thinking about how this plays out in terms of our public engagement, in terms of our forward-facing social media, as well as our classes and all engagements that we have.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one last question, and this is from an anonymous attendee. And they say, as a public health doctor, I've watched physicians in this pandemic without any formal public health training or experience become so-called medical experts. It has confused messages, moved us away from science to sound bites, and prioritized media availability over medical authority. From my standpoint, our biggest challenge is internal and about managing ego. Can you comment on media engagement and how this is eroding institutional authority?
Well, I think it's, if I can jump in quickly, a bit of a double-edged sword, which is universities are at a crossroad in terms of what we do, and academics are at a crossroad in terms of our place in society. So if we don't engage in public debate and in pressing debate, we also lose our relevance and our ability to offer important insight. Unfortunately, we're often asked to comment on things in real time. And very much the news cycle is one that goes very rapidly. And journalists will start phoning people between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. in desperate search to find folks. And this is where it's a balance to be able to know when to say no and when to be able to say, hey, hang on a second, I know somebody in the next time zone over, and start tapping the network. And basically, very much as Julia was saying, there's a role to not amplify, and then there's a role to amplify. And the best thing possible is if you can't do the interview, say no, but try to steer it to folks who have the credibility, and don't be afraid not to comment on things that are too far in left field.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, of course. I think it's really important. And one of the things to be mindful of here too is that media hits aren't peer reviewed. Everyone can misspeak. Everyone can have a clip cut down too far so that it no longer makes the kind of sense that was intended. Things can be quoted out of context in really damaging ways, especially in this kind of fluid environment. So, I mean, we have seen this really interesting public debate as the science has changed and adapted, and there have been different political responses. One of the kind of historically fascinating things about the last 2 years is the diversity of provincial responses to the pandemic, and all technically drawing on the science, but taking different approaches based on how cautious they were willing to be. And frankly, when I hear two doctors give two different views on the news, my impulse is to go with the one that is erring on the side of caution. I don't necessarily need to know how it's working because I'm not a medical expert, but if one is saying, oh, you're fine, take off your mask, don't worry about it anymore, we're all good, we're vaccinated, and the other one is saying, maybe you want to wear your mask in crowded places, I'm going to go with that because that's erring on the side of caution. So one of the things I think we can do is think as an academic community ourselves about how it is we engage with the media and what our ethical boundaries are, and what we do when a media representation gets out of control and maybe isn't necessarily the best that we can make it. But also encourage people who are watching that media to think critically about it and to make decisions for themselves. And fundamentally, if you have a serious medical question, don't get your advice from the news. We've got a doctor shortage in this country. I'm well aware of that. I was without a family physician for 2 years myself. But if I had a medical question about my health, I would be going to a family doctor. And I think we need to, the shortage of doctors, I think, has pushed us more online and to trying to get answers from the news. But I think we need to start pushing that back and really think as a country about how important it is to have an effective and available healthcare system, not just for general health of population, but also to push back against misinformation and inaccuracies in the media and everything else. So I think that academic self-reflection is really key, but there are other things that I think that Media Frenzy has highlighted in terms of the healthcare system.
Maybe just the last thing that I'd add to that is that I think this question is great because it identifies that as much as our report is about providing support and protecting researchers, there's also a lot that researchers need to do to be responsible stewards of their expertise of research and as responsible sort of spokespersons for bodies of knowledge, and acknowledging, as Howard noted, to sort of stay in your own lane and highlight other more expertise than you. Like, honestly, you really do have to do, because journalists are busy and underfunded, and they will reach out to you to comment on basically anything. And so it's up to you to check the ego and pass it off. But then maybe that also, I think, leads us to this other group of actors we haven't talked as much about, but media as clearly important communicators of information and important actors in battling mis and disinformation. And I think the report offers some suggestions to that community, but that is perhaps somewhere where we need to do a little more work, is thinking about how to build a robust media ecosystem that can effectively and responsibly harness academic expertise, and then and know when not to.
Great, thank you all for your excellent responses to this question and to so many of them. I fear that we're coming to the end of our time. And so on behalf of the Royal Society of Canada and myself, I want to thank the audience for being here, as well as the panelists, Dr. Clark, Dr. Ramos, and Dr. Wright. I invite you all to please visit the Royal Society of Canada's website to find the full report and other COVID-19 resources. And also please join the conversation on Twitter by following @RSC, capital T, capital A Academies. And if you have any additional questions, please send them by email to events@rsc-src.ca. That's events@rsc-src.ca. So thank you all very much.